finish tonight the Pete Walker. I'm going to finish reading chapter 13. I've done it the last 2 nights, chapter 13. It's complex PTSD from surviving to thriving. And it's a really useful chapter. It's on managing abandonment depression, which comes from childhood trauma, which is really important. The other book that I'm reading at the moment, which is really beautiful, is called Trauma and the Soul. And it's a union therapist, and his name is Donald Kalshed. So I'm going to be not sharing so much from this book, but bits of information that are really beautiful from this book to help understanding that we do have a soul. That's my belief, and that a lot of our trauma, you know, we can question where it comes from. I think some of it, you know, did we come in with it? Did we can look at that at some other point, because it's a fascinating book. And also because I study astrology, it's something that ties in with me believing that we have a soul, and more than that as well. So I'm going to continue reading chapter 13, and here goes. He says, on a parallel with forced hunger, feeling tired is sometimes unrelated to sleep deprivation. It is instead an emotional experience of the abandonment depression. I believe that emotional tiredness comes from not resting enough in a safe relationship with yourself or with another. This emotional exhaustion often masquerades as a psychological tiredness. Unfortunately, over time, the two can become confusingly intertwined. When our abandonment depression is unremedied, either kind of tiredness can trigger us into fear. The inner critic within translates tired into endangering imperfection, which in turn triggers us into the 4F response. And the 4F response is the fight, flight, freeze, fawn. So if you've been through childhood trauma and you're going around getting triggered as an adult, or when you get triggered, what happens is that you will use the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, one of those or 2 of those, which will basically run your life. There's healthy fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, and there's unhealthy. And for me, I use the fight, flight response, which means getting ultra busy and disassociating. And the more psychoeducation we have with regard to CPTSD, which is a response to childhood trauma and unprocessed wounds, then we can begin to heal bit by bit. So as I read this, you can go back through my other videos, but the book that I'm reading from is in the comments, not below the comment section, in the more section, and you can get it free on Amazon USA, and you can get it free also on UK Kindle. So it's Audible on Amazon USA. So the link's below, and it's worth getting a copy so that you can begin to heal this stuff, because therapy is great, but if we don't understand what's going on, it's like, how are we going to heal? So continuing reading, he says, ironically, overreacting to emotional tiredness eventually creates real physical exhaustion via a process I call the clythromic 2-step. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So he says the 2-step is the dance of flight types or subtypes who habitually overreact to their tiredness with workaholic or busyholic activities. Self-medicating with their own adrenaline, they run to counteract the emotional tiredness of the unprocessed abandonment depression. So the thing is, if you were terrorized as a child or abused, it means that your system is basically set to play up and act out in a way like fight, flight, freeze, fawn. So you get the book to understand what that is. He says here, eventually, however, many exhaust themselves physically and become temporarily too depleted or sick to continue running. So a lot of people who've had childhood trauma as well, as adults have autoimmune issues and other things going on. And it's basically to do with the cortisol levels in the body, that our emotional states, we're so wired that we don't really, and hypervigilant, that we don't rest properly. We're always sort of looking over our shoulder. And if you imagine that you had to do that as a child for years and years and years, or you were spoken to cruelly and stuff like that, you're going to expect that as an adult. So you're wired and you're going around in a state which is allowing your adrenals, the cortisol, to kick in. So you never get proper rest. You're never relaxed enough in life. And you might relate to what I'm saying here. Going on, he says, I'm going to read this bit again. Eventually, however, many exhaust themselves physically and become temporarily too depleted or sick to continue running. At such times, they collapse into accumulated depression so painful that they relaunch desperately into flight speed at the first sign of replenished adrenaline. Survivors with this pattern sometimes misdiagnose themselves as bipolar because of their abrupt vacillations between adrenaline highs and abandonment lows. So if you can think that, that we're playing out, and also that a lot of people that I know that have got CPTSD are labeling themselves as bipolar or ADHD. I mean, I don't know where we're getting all of these diagnoses from. I personally have not diagnosed myself with anything other than understanding that I've read this book, which is Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, which is not a disorder. It's a response to years and years of abuse as a child, which means that as an adult, you react in certain ways. And this book spells it out. It expels out what CPTSD is. It explains that it's a response, that it's not a disorder. And I think it's very, not helpful to us to be labeling ourselves with things that we don't have, like, bipolar or ADHD, or I'm this or I'm that. It's like, who is, I've asked people, when I've spoken to people and I say, oh, how do you know you've got that? And I said, did a doctor diagnose it? And, a lot of people say no, we've got to stop labeling ourselves and really just get to understand what's going on with our responses. Going on, he says, also noteworthy here is the futile journey that many survivors undergo, treating emotional tiredness with physiologically based methods. The limited efficiency of such an approach, however, typically makes us feel shameful. What's wrong with me? I've changed everything in my diet and in my sleep and exercise regime. I've taken every available supplement and seen every type of practitioner imaginable, and I still wake up feeling dead tired. There is a healthy way out of this cul-de-sac of misdirected striving. It lies in cultivating self-kindness during those inevitable times when you feel tired, bad, lonely, or depressed. So we need to start treating our inner child with love, and we need to be kind. And if you imagine you've got an inner child that needs love and it needs kindness, and we start doing that, we're going to start healing a lot of this stuff. He goes on to say that we can work our way out of this. In this regard, it is notable, he says, AA 12-step acronym, HALT. It says, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired can be helpful. I will say my own experience of AA. I went to AA for 3 months to stop drinking in 2012. I started going there on the 11th of June 2012, and by the 2nd of July 2012, I stopped disassociating using alcohol, and I've not had a drink since. But I only went to AA for 12 weeks, 3 months. Thomas says, I'm just looking at a comment here. Thomas says the DSM-5 sort of helps enable that professional labeling behavior you just met. Yes, and Thomas, it's not helpful. It's like, we don't need the labels. We need practical information. And that's why I'm reading this book, so that people can understand that with practical information, if we get rid of our inner critic, we get healthy anger, healthy blame, and a lot of things that society are against. They say, oh, you can't blame your parents, and you can't, just get over it. What's wrong with you? And, we need to start working with our inner child and start lavishing that child with love and respect and honor, and begin to talk to ourselves in a different way. And this is work. It's not something that happens overnight. He goes on to say here also, he says, if you can then work to generate the internal self-compassionate attention described above. So we need compassionate attention instead of like having a go at ourselves all the time, telling ourselves that there's something wrong with us, because we probably heard that as a child and we're just repeating what we heard. He says here, separating necessary suffering from unnecessary suffering. You can sometimes gain motivation for this difficult work by seeing your depressed feelings as messages from your inner child, who is feeling as abandoned as he or she ever was. Perhaps this time you can come to him with your remothering self in a more comforting and protective way. Through such practice, you can gradually achieve the healing that Buddhists call separating necessary suffering, which is normal fear and depression, from unnecessary suffering, unconscious self-abandonment to helplessness and toxic shame. CPTSD, fear, neurotransmitting, re-traumatizing inner critic acting in, and 4F acting out. So the 4Fs, fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. So you get triggered by something. For instance, if I saw a big snake on the floor right now, I might go into fight. I might, like get really aggressive with that snake, or I might flight and start running around the room, or I might freeze, or I might, which means I'm literally going to freeze, or I might fawn and, start, I don't know, talking to the snake nicely or something like that. That made me laugh. That's a bit of an example. But the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, we really need to understand what that is, because if we don't understand it, then we can't help ourselves. Below this video, you're going to see 13 steps for managing flashbacks, and you're going to see 14 steps for managing your inner critic, because the inner critic needs to go. Otherwise, if you're thinking crap thoughts about yourself, you're not going to help yourself. So now he says, recovery is progressive. He says, I begin this section by repeating the chapter 4 section, stages of recovery. This section outlines the overall course of recovery. Hopefully you will notice, since you began reading this book, that your understanding of CPTSD has not been significantly enhanced. I also hope that you have a greater sense of self-compassion and direction in your recovery progress. Although we can often work on many levels of recovering at the same time, recovering is to some degree progressive. It begins on the cognitive level, then psychoeducation and mindfulness helps us to understand that we have CPTSD. So when we say I have CPTSD, I'm not saying I have a disorder. What I'm saying is that I act out based on the fact that I was traumatized as a child and had such horrific events happen to me that I basically am having experiences and I need to re-educate myself. And Thomas says, self-compassion is a wonderful concept. We often think of compassion as something going from ourselves, perhaps from our hearts outwards towards another. We forget to send it towards our heart. Yes, so that's why we need to get a relationship going with our inner child. I have one with my inner child, and my inner child in my mind, she's about 5 years old, and I adore her now and I stand up for her. So I have healthy mothering and healthy fathering. I'll protect her. I'm fierce in her protection, and I adore her and nurture her as well. Whether she's tired, grumpy, and whatever mood she's in, she's going to get the deserved attention that she needs, that she never got. So then he goes on to say, this awakening then allows us to learn how to approach the journey of deconstructing the various life-spoiling dynamics of CPTSD, which is not a disorder, it is the response to events, okay? He says, still, on the cognitive level, we take our next steps into the long work of shrinking the critic. And it is long work. It's taken me about 2 years to really get it, okay? I got this book in 2017, November, and we're not 2 years, but a good year. And when I first started listening to my inner critic, I was shocked at how awful this inner critic was to me. You know, the way I looked, the way where I was at in my life. It was really just toxic shaming me. He goes on to say, some survivors will need to do a great deal of work on this level before they can move down to the emotional layer of work, which is learning how to grieve effectively. The phase of intensely grieving our childhood losses can last for a couple of years. And it did for me. There were a lot of tears and a lot of anger, healthy tears and healthy anger. When sufficient progress is made in grieving, the survivor naturally drops down into the next level of recovery work. This involves working through fear by grieving our loss of safety in the world. And when I began to realize I was so hypervigilant, going through life, like hypervigilance, because I lived a childhood of being hypervigilant. So it just makes sense that you go around being an adult who's hypervigilant and, not being able to trust people, and then, not being able to make healthy choices and not being able to stand up for yourself and say no to people. So there's a lot of knock-on effects of child abuse, be it physical, sexual, verbal, and emotional abuse. He goes on to say, at this level, we also learn to work through our toxic shame by grieving the loss of our self-esteem. So I was shocked how low my self-esteem was. I mean, it was horrible. And also with low self-esteem, it means that we get involved with people in relationships that are not good for us. And because our self-esteem is so bad, it means we accept and tolerate behavior that is, not nice. So that it's worth doing this work and it's worth getting this book. He goes on to say, as we become more adept in this type of deep level grieving, we are then ready to address the core issue of our CPTSD response, the abandonment depression itself. The final task here involves releasing the armoring and physiological reactivity in our body to the abandonment depression via the somatic work discussed in this chapter. This work culminates with learning to compassionately support ourselves through our experiences of depression. So, it's okay to feel depression, and there's a reason why I feel depressed. So if we can, it's not about acceptance, it's the wrong word, but it's like understanding I'm depressed because I've had these experiences, I'm working on this depression, and I'm not just going to push it away by disassociating, by drinking, by overeating, I'm going to sit with this and see what's going on, and also get help. Go and get therapy if you can. If you're in the UK, and you have this and you've had severe childhood trauma, it may be possible to get sessions through your doctor. I don't know about in the USA. I don't know what the systems are out there, but I think it's harder in the USA. But continuing, he says, finally, as we will see in the next chapter, many survivors need some relational help in achieving the complex tasks involved in deconstructing each layer in our old pain exasperating defenses. So for the people out in the USA, there are groups on Facebook. There are people that probably do free things. There are lots of them. I have a ladies group that people can join that I put information in. And there are other groups that I know of for the guys out there that I can link you into if you want to join a few Facebook groups that support this stuff, that are kind as well. They're nice groups to join. So then he goes on to say, a Swiss Army knife approach to a flashback. So what he's saying is that a quick route to it. He says that this is a final example of addressing all the layers of reactivity in resolving a flashback. So a flashback is an emotional feeling. It can be a tone of voice you hear. It's a trigger which will push you into a flashback, or a flashback that will push you into anxiety or panic attacks. He says, when I started this work over 3 decades ago, I ate very poorly and did not know how to soothe and nurture myself with healthy food. After some years of recovery work, however, I deeply intuited that I needed to cook more in order to take self-nurturance to the next level. I had not cooked more, however, because I hated to cook. Luckily, I embraced cooking anyway as a labor of love. Nonetheless, cooking was for a very long time a very trying and unpleasant experience for me. This was, in fact, much like my many years of struggling to get the upper hand on the critic. So for me, when I'd go into this state, I wouldn't eat and I'd just lose weight, and I'm small anyway. And other people do, overeating. So undereating and being too thin is as bad as, it's not, I'm not judging it, but overeating can be, very painful for people as well, because people who overeat don't want to overeat, but they're doing it to soothe. So it's not judgment, because I know I wouldn't eat, I wouldn't eat enough. And then I'd have, similar. So I've got to make sure I eat enough to keep my weight on. And people say to me, oh, you're so lucky. Well, really it's a painful thing to have to address, but we've got to nurture ourselves and do what needs to be done. And I'm also great with, vitamins now, or supplements, looking after myself. He goes on to say, but back to cooking, which became a central piece of my self-remothering work. It was not until I understood more about the dynamics of my flight response that I realized how much I rushed around when I was cooking. I then realized that via increased mindfulness, I discovered that the smallest unforeseen obstacle could set off what felt like a small electric shock in my chest. Examples of these obstacles included something spilled. So if you spilled something, a lid too tight to open, an extra unanticipated task, or the clock showing me that I was behind schedule. In an instant, any of these normal hindrances could send me rushing around the kitchen into a low-grade panic. Whenever this occurred, I would then inhale my meal as soon as it was ready, just to get the ordeal over with. This is an example of what a common everyday flashback looked like in adulthood. It is so often minor daily frustrations that trigger us back into flashbacks, rather than incidents that repeat the gross insults and ordeals of our childhood. With ongoing recovery work, I realized that anything to do with food could easily flash me back to the family dinner table, the battlefield of my dysfunctional family. So for me, I'm just thinking about it, what pushes me into flashbacks? There's certain things that push me into flashbacks, like if I feel I'm being abandoned, or feeling that people don't like me, that because that was one of my things that, I didn't feel loved as a child. So if I don't hear from people, I can think that I've done something that hurt them, or I've done something wrong, and I'll overthink. And that's one of the things that happens for me. But for each of us, it can be different. He says here, many productive grieving sessions came out of this. He says, with ongoing recovery work, I realized that anything to do with food could easily flash me back to the family dinner table. Many productive grieving sessions came out of this. They led me to an epiphany that doing anything intricate with lots of steps also flashed me back into feeling picked apart by my parents. So another thing that does that to me, it's paperwork and forms. Like, I like to think of myself like I'm quite an intelligent person. Like, I love to read, like some of the books I'm reading, Carl Jung and, deep books on psychology. But when it comes to filling in forms, I go into flashbacks and get quite, stressed out and start going back into childhood memories. So for each of us, it will be different. We can look at what puts me into flashbacks and begin to deal with these things. He also says here, there was, however, a huge part of my food trauma that I could not shrink until I started the somatic work described in this chapter. Since then, years of practicing somatic mindfulness has greatly reduced my hair-triggerable anxiety around cooking. This, however, is still a work in progress. In terms of the cycles of reactivity, my occasional flashbacks around food and food preparation can look like this. I have 30 minutes to cook and eat my breakfast before I leave for work. I come into the kitchen and oh no, the sink is full of dishes, but I forgot to clean last night. I immediately notice that I'm about to launch into a frenzied dishwashing when flashback management step 1 rises to the front of my consciousness that I am having a flashback. So the 13 steps for managing flashbacks, which you can also print off, it's a PDF file linked to Pete Walker's webpage, who wrote this book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. There's a list here that will begin to help you stop having flashbacks and going into panic and anxiety attacks. So it's really important to look at that and print off a copy and carry it with you, or leave a few around the house, or carry in your bag or in your wallet. It's 2 pages, A4 pages if you print it off. And then as you read them, as you're traveling and whatever you're doing, like you're getting on a train or a bus, or what, you'll begin to get to understand what you're doing. So if I say to myself, oh, I'm having a flashback, then a flashback, I snap out of it a lot quicker. If I don't say that to myself, I stay in it. And it used to be for weeks and days, weeks, months, I remain in flashback. Now they can last about 30 minutes and sometimes even less. I'll get triggered and then I say I'm having a flashback and I deal with myself. Yeah, the book recommendation, Rona Fan 69, the book recommendation, it's free on USA Audio, Amazon, and free on Kindle UK, Amazon. So look for the link below. I've got both. I've got the, I don't have Kindle, I have the hard copy, and I also have it on Audible, but it's not Pete Walker reading it on Audible, but it's still good enough. And also I find that reading, I take more in myself. So he goes on to say, then he goes, because the 13 steps, so then he says, then I go directly to step 7 and attempt to ease back into my body. I sit in my favorite stuffed chair, close my eyes, and bring my awareness to my abdomen, where my anxiety typically makes it most strident change. I can feel tightness and in just below my diaphragm, and I feel afraid and get a picture of my father's big hands squeezing my small intestines. So the thing is, his father was really cruel to him. The thing I do that I realized for years that I do, when I go into flashbacks, I'd sit there and I'd basically be going like this around my neck. And for me, I was never allowed to speak about my trauma. Even as an adult to my family, I was cut off from speaking about it. So I had this thing where I'd completely always be doing this. And I had a few friends ask me, what's doing? Are you okay? But that's what I do. One of my reactions when I go into flashbacks. And the other thing is I don't like necklaces around my neck. And, and the other thing that I do when I go into flashbacks, like if I was eating, I believe that I wasn't going to be able to swallow food or stuff like that. Tapping helped with that. Like if I'd go into, which I'm trained in, faster EFT, would it mean that if I go into a flashback and I thought I couldn't swallow, like I can't swallow supplements, I have to empty out the capsules because I get anxiety around that. So we all get anxiety around different things. Experiencing what happened. Yeah, Thomas, I'm just experientially what happens. I think there's a question mark there, but I'm not sure. Okay, I can see a question mark, but I'm not sure what it's to. I'm curious about the flashbacks. Okay, so we're all going to have flashbacks, but it's going to be different for all of us. But the list is below this video, okay? So then he would say, so he would go into, I am safe and I am relaxing. And then he'd say, I slow and deepen my breath and feel the muscles in my belly as much as I can. I feel the slow cycle of these muscles relaxing and contracting with the ebbing and flowing of my breath. The cycle gradually becomes more fluid as I attend to it. After about 50 inhalations, I feel a swollen sensation of tiredness diffusing, like ink throughout my body. My gut momentarily retightens to ward off that awful deadening feeling of abandonment depression. But I surrender to the deadness. I do this because I know the tight feeling is fear and that it will soon morph into the screaming critic telling me that I'm going to be late for work. I say no to the critic's siren call. You can do this if you hurry, tempting me back into the flight, fight, flee, freeze, fawn response. I stay with the deadened, tired, lifeless feeling and try to feel it more and welcome it. So there's so many tools we can use. Therapy, reading, what he's saying here, welcoming is actually the Sedona method. There's a method called the Sedona method where you welcome what you feel. Tapping, faster EFT, is good for getting rid of pulling you out of the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response as well in the moment. But sometimes in our early stages, we won't get what's going on unless we got the psychoeducation. Then he said, because I am so well practiced, the depression starts to gradually morph into a widening sense of relaxation. It spreads throughout my body and my body begins to feel like an easy chair. So also there's EMDR that, there's so many things we can do. Right, I'm going to read, there's last 2 pages here. He says, I look at my watch and it has taken 20 minutes of my precious time. I realize my critic is trying to sneak back in and is goading me with the remark, he has taken 20 minutes of my precious time. I disidentify from the critic. So we have to disidentify from our inner critic. It's like if we're late, to catch a train, we're better off, as an example, you're better off calling people and say, I'm running 10 minutes late, and then just slow down. The more we get ourselves to slow down, the better we're going to feel. Nobody's going to die. It's like if we're 10 minutes late, it's like we need to start being really kind. It's to your inner child and taking the inner child's needs into account. And also the fact if you've had a heinous or a horrendous childhood, you've got to start loving that inner child, because that inner child's had no love. It's like, for many of us, harsh abuse is like soul murder, because it switches off that wonder and the joy in the child. He goes on here to say, I disidentify from the critic and shift into my refathering self-thought. Correct the critic, saying, it's okay, Pete, this is all small potatoes. You are not in danger. Step 2, and this is definitely no emergency. So it's talking to our inner child. I take a moment with the angering part of grieving, step 9, the 13 steps below this video, okay? Print them off. Step 9, and reinforce my boundaries against my internalized parents. So the internalized parents are the ones that are goading us, and that's what we've got to switch off, and it takes time and awareness. So his parents would have said, his internalized parents, his parents said to him, screw you. His mum would have said, screw you, for frightening. So you can speak to your internalized parents saying, screw you, Helen and Charlie, for frightening me so much and making my mistakes, making me feel that I've made mistakes that freak me out when things don't go perfectly. So, if you've been through abuse and your parents like goaded you for being late or telling you that you're stupid or there's something wrong with you, you're going to say that to yourself as an adult, realize that you have been conditioned. And unfortunately, but fortunately, we are the ones that get to decondition ourselves. This is our job. He goes on to say, how many times have I been stuck in that drivenness and I know how to stop? So once we understand how we're going to stop it, we're in control. He says, I return to thought corrections. So like I was saying, Pete, it's okay. You talk to your inner child. So it's like I say to my Penelope, my little girl, I say, it's okay. It's okay. I love you. You're safe now. And you can do that with yourself. You just put your name there, like I've just done. You tell yourself that stuff. That's your inner child. He says, you always show up at your office an hour early anyway. You can take 20 minutes off this routine. You can stay in this relaxed state a bit longer and still have time to get everything done in a realistic manner. I feel the sense of triumph I sometimes see in my clients when they have worked hard to successfully manage and resolve a flashback. So we need to resolve our flashbacks, and we're going to do that by getting rid of our inner critic to begin with. Then he says, when we realize that it works, which I began to realize dealing with my inner critic, I began to see that this stuff worked. And so it made me do it more. He says, this time I broke the cycle and did not let my triggered flight response get much further than some momentary rushing. I stopped this cycle of reactivity from devolving into an inner critic diabate against myself. I didn't indulge in the outer critic and let it make me pin the undone dishes on my wife. So that's the other thing with the inner critic and the outer critic. The abuse we've received, we can put that onto other people as well. It doesn't mean we're abusing them, but it just means that we're, acting out and we're not being calm. He goes on to say, I chose to stay with the depression. I bypassed the shame and the fear, and I have gotten stuck in 10,000 times before when I could not accept my current state of being. So this learns us to be accepting of ourselves. He said, I refuse to abandon myself like the sinking ship I thought I was. Like Helen and Charlie abandoned me, that's his parents, Helen and Charlie, as a kid, on a daily, hourly, yearly basis. So I was abandoned on a daily basis. From the age of 3, my first memories, I was abandoned daily by all of the adults around me. There were a few nice ones, but they weren't around long enough to protect me. So then he goes on to say, I am also happy to report that I now cook regularly and triggering is relatively rare. I have even gotten to enjoy my own cooking so much that I rarely eat out. So what I'm going to show you is this is the book. Please get a copy, free copy you can get if you look at the links below. And I'm going to come back with some more. The other book that I'm reading is The Trauma of the Soul, which is a beautiful book. And I'll pick into some of these pieces in here because it's so stunning. It's by a gentleman called Donald Kalship. So I won't be able to read all of this book because I've not asked, but I did ask Pete Walker, who wrote this book. I did email him and said to him, is it okay if I read this on social media, Facebook and or to YouTube? And he said yes. So that's it. I'm going to go for today. Let me just see if there's any messages there. And I thank for the people that stick with this and watch this. Rhonda, you said the emotional reaction, one repressed, is an ancient traumatic experience, seeks in constant cycles to be discharged. That's it, because it's being discharged and we have to realize that's what's going on. And then you also say, but does so only partially, bringing up the distressing emotions like symbolic material attached to them. Yes, and also, and we don't know when we're going to have nightmares. Like I have flashback nightmares sometimes and I'll wake up. I had to do things like get myself a salt lamp, like because I couldn't sleep with the light off. And it was only last year I bought a salt lamp and treated myself to, being soothed as I went to bed, because I got to a point where as an adult, I couldn't turn off the light to go to sleep. I was terrified, all of these flashbacks started coming up and, we have to look after ourselves. We have to look for little solutions. We have to have friends that get us, that aren't just going to tell us to let it go and forgive. So, by all means, do the spirituality and the law of attraction stuff, whatever you're doing, but do your CPTSD work as well. Okay. Trauma and the Soul is one also looking to read. Yeah, The Trauma and the Soul. That's a beautiful, beautiful book. A lot of Carl Jung's work is mentioned in this book. So that's it. I'm going to go and I'll be back in a couple of days or tomorrow, whenever I feel like I'll come back on and do some more reading. Thanks all for watching. And for the people that don't comment, know that I can't see who is, I can't see who's watching, which is good. So you've got your anonymity. Kaushad's book is on my list. Yeah, it really touched my soul. I mean, I'm on chapter 2 and he says, there's a quote in here, he says, there is another world, but it is in this one. And that was said, I don't know if you can see this here. I don't know if you can see this picture. I don't know. I'm just going to show you. Let me see, because there's a delay on this video, so I can't see if I'm showing it yet. But you can, if you can see it, and I believe that to be true. It's like we get you can. It's like we lose ourselves. It's like soul murder. It sounds a bit heavy, but he says that it's like having our childhood taken away from us. And, I'm so grateful that I've turned out to be who I am. And I've got the relational skills to be able to deal with this stuff and talk about it. And I've got no toxic shame. And in my view, I'm dealing with the abuse that I suffered for years and years, all of my childhood gracefully. And it's okay to have healthy anger and healthy blame. It doesn't, don't let people tell you any different. Get the CPTSD book and start healing, and also the very important, healing is not all or nothing. Some days it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because we don't know when we're going to be triggered. So we have to be really gentle with ourselves and just soothe ourselves. And I know it's not that easy. I went a bit nuts before I started getting better. I will tell you, that's my truth. Yes, I have. Gabo Mate. I think it's Gab. Yes, I have, Thomas. Yeah, he's got some brilliant videos. I think on my playlist, I've saved a few of his on my YouTube channel. I've got a little playlist of his, a couple of his videos. Brum Friend says, how old were you when you had your significant breakthrough in healing your trauma? Well, the thing is, it's ongoing, but I think it's significant. I had a major breakdown in 2016, October 2016. I was very badly triggered by somebody in spiritual groups, and I went into a flashback that I didn't come out of I sort of went into shaking over something that happened. And I lost then a business that I'd had for 29 years. My life literally fell to bits. I lost 20 pounds in weight. I was 125 pounds. I lost 20 pounds in weight. And I also, my hair started falling out. And bit by bit, it's been growing back. You know, it was it's been a hard path. And then I went to my doctor and I said, I really need therapy. So I've been doing many, many things, you know, in order to heal. So I think I'm much better than I used to be. I love the picture with the Paul. Yes, I can't pronounce that second name. I'll have to see what that guy Paul, Eluard or something. Yeah, it's beautiful. So this book, you know, really beautiful, but see PTSD one first. All right, I'll be back in a couple of days or tomorrow. You'll see me when I'm there. Okay, catch you all later. Thank you for being with me. Thank you.